Every year, over 4 million people visit Yellowstone National Park. They stand in front of Old Faithful, cameras ready, waiting for the geyser to erupt right on schedule. They hike through valleys where bison roam, take selfies at the Grand Prismatic Spring, marvel at waterfalls that seem untouched by human hands. Guidebooks call it America's Best Idea, the first national park in the world, a triumph of conservation. A place where nature has been protected for the benefit and enjoyment of the people since 1872. But here's what those 4 million visitors don't know. When President Ulysses S. Grant signed the Yellowstone Park Act on March 1, 1872, creating the first national park in history, this land wasn't empty. It wasn't wilderness waiting to be discovered. It wasn't untouched. For over 10,000 years, this 2.2 million-acre expanse had been home to 5 distinct nations: the Shoshone, the Bannock, the Crow, the Blackfeet, and the Nez Perce. They had names for every valley, every thermal spring, every mountain peak. They had trade routes that stretched 1,200 miles in every direction. They had burial grounds where generations of their ancestors rested. They had seasonal camps where families returned every year, following patterns older than any European settlement in North America. And within 2 years of the park's creation, every single one of them was gone. Not by choice, not because they decided to leave. They were forcibly removed by the United States Army. Their camps were dismantled. Their sacred sites were declared off-limits. Historical records from the era document what officials carefully called the removal of unauthorized inhabitants. But there's a more accurate word for what happened. This is the story that history books often overlook. Because the creation of America's most beloved national park required something that doesn't fit the narrative of conservation and natural beauty. It required the systematic expulsion of the people who had lived there since time immemorial. Dakota stands at the edge of the lower falls, watching the Yellowstone River plunge 308 feet into the canyon below. She's 26, visiting from Portland, and this is her 3rd day in the park. She's taken hundreds of photos, posted them to Instagram with captions about finding herself in nature, about disconnecting from the modern world. She feels peaceful here, connected to something ancient and pure. She has no idea that 150 years ago, a Shoshone woman her age might have stood in this exact spot, watching the same waterfall, moments before soldiers arrived to force her family from the only home they had ever known. The official story tells us that Yellowstone was created because forward-thinking Americans recognized the need to preserve natural wonders for future generations. The year 1872 is celebrated as a milestone in environmental history. But documents from that period reveal something different. The expeditions that discovered Yellowstone weren't led by conservationists. They were financed by railroad companies looking for tourist attractions. The men who pushed for the park's creation weren't naturalists. They were businessmen who saw profit in selling access to geysers and hot springs. And the real reason this specific land needed to be designated as a national park, with federal troops stationed to guard it, had nothing to do with protecting wildlife. It had everything to do with removing the people who were already there. This is the story of how America's best idea was built on a foundation of broken treaties and forced displacement. How the first national park became possible only after the original inhabitants were erased from the landscape and from history itself. And how, for over 150 years, millions of visitors have walked through Yellowstone without ever knowing whose land they're standing on. To understand what was lost, you have to go back further than 1872. Long before the United States government drew lines on a map and called this place a national park, the Shoshone people knew it as the land of burning ground and smoking waters. They had a word for what we now call geysers, for the hot springs that could heal wounds, for the patterns of steam that rose from the earth in winter mornings. This wasn't just hunting territory. It was sacred ground, woven into their spiritual practices, their medicine, their understanding of how the world worked. The thermal features that modern tourists photograph were places where Shoshone healers brought the sick, where ceremonies were held, where the boundary between the physical and spiritual world felt thin. Washakie, the leader of the eastern Shoshone, knew every valley in what would become Yellowstone. His people had summered in these mountains for generations, following elk herds through high meadows, gathering roots and berries, fishing in rivers so clear you could count stones on the bottom. They weren't nomads wandering aimlessly. They were following precise seasonal routes, returning to the same campsites their grandparents had used, maintaining the landscape through controlled burns that kept meadows open and game populations healthy. Archaeological evidence, which wouldn't be properly documented until the 1980s and 90s, shows over 10,000 years of continuous human presence here. 10,000 years. Stone tools, fire rings, hunting blinds, ceremonial circles. This was someone's home long before it became anyone's park. The Crow called the Yellowstone River Elk River and traveled through the northern reaches of the park to reach their hunting grounds. The Bannock followed a trail that ran directly through what is now the heart of Yellowstone, a route they had used for so long that it wore a visible path into the earth, a path that modern park rangers would later pave over and rename the Grand Loop Road. The Blackfeet came from the north, and the Nez Perce from the west, all of them drawn to this place where the earth itself seemed alive, where hot water burst from the ground, where minerals painted the rocks in colors that didn't exist anywhere else. Caleb Greenwood, a fur trader who lived among the Shoshone in the 1840s and 1850s, left written accounts of their relationship with this land. He described summer camps near the Lamar Valley where hundreds of people would gather, not just for hunting, but for trade, for marriages between different bands, for councils where elders made decisions about territory and resources. He wrote about traveling with Shoshone guides to Obsidian Cliff, a mountain of volcanic glass that the Shoshone had quarried for over 11,000 years. They shaped this obsidian into arrowheads, knives, and scrapers so valuable that archaeologists have found them in trading networks stretching from the Pacific coast to the Great Lakes, evidence that Yellowstone wasn't isolated wilderness, but a hub in a vast indigenous economy. The hot springs held particular significance. Historical accounts from early explorers, those who actually talked to native guides instead of just claiming discovery, describe how different springs were used for different purposes. Some were for healing skin conditions, others for spiritual purification. The Shoshone had names for the major thermal features, names that described their characteristics, their temperament, their sacred meaning. None of those names appear on park signs today. When you visit Grand Prismatic Spring or Morning Glory Pool, you're looking at places that had indigenous names, indigenous significance, indigenous history for thousands of years before they were renamed by expedition members who spent a few weeks here and declared themselves discoverers. In 1868, the United States government signed the Fort Bridger Treaty with the Eastern Shoshone, officially recognizing their territory and promising federal protection of their lands. The treaty maps clearly showed that a significant portion of what would become Yellowstone fell within Shoshone territory. Washakie, who had allied with the United States during conflicts with other tribes, believed this treaty would protect his people's access to their traditional lands. He was 57 years old when he signed it, a respected leader who had spent decades navigating the impossible position of trying to preserve his people's way of life, while the world around them changed beyond recognition. He trusted the treaty. He had no reason yet to understand that in 4 years, everything that paper promised would become meaningless. But that trust was already being undermined before the ink on the Fort Bridger Treaty had fully dried. In the summer of 1870, an expedition led by a military officer named Lieutenant Gustavus Doane entered the Yellowstone region under the pretense of exploration and scientific survey. Doane wasn't a scientist, he wasn't a naturalist. He was a cavalry officer fresh from an assignment that should tell you everything you need to know about what was coming. Just months earlier, in January of 1870, Doane had participated in what became known as the Marias Massacre, an incident on the northern Montana plains where United States troops attacked a Blackfeet camp in the early morning. The historical record shows that 217 Blackfeet people perished that day, most of them women, children, and elderly, as the young men were away hunting. Doane's report described it as a military victory. This was the man now surveying Yellowstone, taking notes on its resources, its accessibility, its potential value. The Washburn-Langford-Doane expedition of 1870 spent a month in the region, and their reports back to Washington painted Yellowstone as an untouched wonderland, a place of such unique natural features that it deserved special protection. They described geysers, hot springs, waterfalls, and canyons in breathless detail. What they didn't describe, what they carefully omitted from their official reports, were the people they encountered, the Shoshone camps they saw, the trails that were clearly maintained and regularly used, the evidence of human presence that existed everywhere they looked. In their version of Yellowstone, the indigenous peoples simply didn't exist. It was as if they had decided that to make this place a park, they first had to make it empty on paper. On March 1, 1872, President Grant signed the Yellowstone Park Act into law. The legislation described the area as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people, and placed it under exclusive control of the Secretary of the Interior. The Fort Bridger Treaty, signed just 4 years earlier, was not mentioned. The indigenous nations who held treaty rights to portions of this land were not consulted. Nathaniel Langford, one of the expedition members who had helped survey the region, was appointed as the first superintendent of Yellowstone National Park. Interestingly, he received no salary for this position. He made his money through other means, primarily by facilitating concessions and business opportunities within the park, arrangements that would benefit from having as few complications as possible, complications like indigenous peoples asserting treaty rights to hunt, fish, or gather on their traditional lands. The removal didn't happen with a single dramatic event. It happened gradually, systematically, through a series of encounters that were rarely documented in any detail. Park regulations prohibited hunting, fishing, and gathering by anyone without specific authorization. Indigenous peoples who had exercised these rights for thousands of years suddenly found themselves classified as poachers on their own land. When Shoshone or Bannock hunting parties were found within park boundaries, they were escorted out by military personnel, their catches confiscated, their presence recorded as violations of park rules. The historical archives contain dozens of brief incident reports from this period, terse official language that describes removal of unauthorized persons without naming them, without explaining where they were sent, without recording what happened to those who resisted or returned. By 1877, the pattern was well established. The park existed, indigenous peoples were not welcome, and military force would ensure compliance. That summer, this policy collided with one of the most tragic chapters in American history, an event that would bring the true nature of Yellowstone's creation into sharp relief. The Nez Perce, facing forced relocation from their ancestral lands in Oregon and Idaho, chose to flee rather than submit. Led by Chief Joseph and other leaders, approximately 800 Nez Perce, including women, children, and elders, began a desperate journey toward Canada and freedom. Their route took them directly through Yellowstone National Park. For 13 days in August of 1877, the Nez Perce moved through Yellowstone, pursued by multiple Army columns. They were exhausted, running low on supplies, trying to protect their families, while evading soldiers who had orders to force their surrender. During this time, they encountered several groups of tourists in the park, visitors who had traveled to see the geysers and hot springs, unaware they were about to witness history. One of those tourists was Emma Cowan, a young woman from Montana who was traveling with her husband and other family members. The Nez Perce detained the Cowan party for several days, and Emma later wrote a detailed account of her experience. She described being treated with consideration, even kindness, by people who were themselves in desperate circumstances. The Nez Perce eventually released the Cowan party unharmed, even returning their horses and supplies, before continuing their flight northward. Emma Cowan made it home safely and lived to write her memoirs. The Nez Perce traveled another 40 miles north to the Bear Paw Mountains, where they were surrounded by Army forces just 30 miles short of the Canadian border. After a siege lasting 5 days, Chief Joseph surrendered. The survivors were sent to reservations far from their homeland. Many did not survive the journey. The contrast is almost unbearable to consider. Tourists who wandered into Yellowstone by choice, who encountered the Nez Perce by accident, were protected and released by people who had every reason to be hostile. Those same people, weeks later, were hunted down and forced onto land they had never seen, separated from everything they knew. Within 2 years of the park's creation, the ethnic cleansing was complete. Yellowstone was officially empty of its indigenous inhabitants, ready to be marketed as pristine wilderness, as if no one had ever called it home. The question that demands asking is why? Why this land specifically? Why was it so urgent to create a national park in 1872, at a moment when the United States government was dealing with Reconstruction, economic instability, and ongoing conflicts across the Western Territories? The answer, as documents from the era make clear, had less to do with conservation and far more to do with commerce. Behind the noble language about preserving natural wonders for future generations stood a group of men with very specific financial interests, men who understood that Yellowstone's geysers and hot springs could be transformed into profit if they could just control access to them. Jay Cooke was one of the most powerful bankers in America, the man who had helped finance the Union Army during the Civil War. By 1870, he had turned his attention westward, specifically to the Northern Pacific Railroad, a massive project designed to connect the Great Lakes to the Pacific coast. Cooke had invested millions in this railroad, and he needed a compelling reason for wealthy passengers to choose his route over competing lines. Tourist attractions, destinations that would draw paying customers. When reports of Yellowstone's geysers began circulating, Cooke recognized an opportunity. He quietly financed portions of the Washburn-Langford-Doane expedition, providing funds and logistical support for what was officially described as a scientific survey. Nathaniel Langford, the man who would become Yellowstone's first superintendent, worked directly for Cooke as a railroad promoter. This wasn't coincidence. The expedition was designed from the start to assess Yellowstone's commercial potential, to determine how it could be packaged and sold to tourists who would travel west on Cooke's railroad. Ferdinand Hayden, a geologist who led a more extensive government expedition to Yellowstone in 1871, produced the report and photographs that ultimately convinced Congress to create the national park. His survey was thorough, running to over 500 pages, filled with detailed descriptions of thermal features, geological formations, and wildlife populations. What makes Hayden's report remarkable, however, is not what it included, but what it omitted. In 500 pages of documentation about Yellowstone, Hayden barely mentioned the indigenous peoples who lived there. When he did reference them, it was in passing, as if they were wildlife to be noted, and moved on from, not human beings with established communities and treaty rights. This wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate choice. To sell Yellowstone as a park, as a tourist destination, as a place that needed federal protection, Hayden and his sponsors needed it to be wilderness. Empty wilderness. Indigenous peoples with legitimate claims to the land complicated that narrative, so they were simply written out of the story. The second superintendent of Yellowstone, Philetus Norris, took office in 1877 and immediately set about making the park more accessible to tourists and less hospitable to its original inhabitants. He built roads that deliberately ran through areas where indigenous hunting camps had traditionally been located, forcing confrontations that always ended the same way, with military escorts removing people who had every right to be there. Norris oversaw the construction of Fort Yellowstone, a military installation that was officially justified as necessary to prevent poaching and protect the park's natural resources. In practice, the fort served as a base for patrols whose primary function was to ensure that indigenous peoples stayed out. Documents from the fort's early years show that soldiers spent far more time removing native hunters than they did protecting wildlife from any other threat. During this same period, something else was happening, something that would ensure the cultural erasure was as complete as the physical removal. Artifacts began disappearing from Yellowstone. Stone tools, ceremonial objects, anything that indicated long-term human presence was collected, catalogued, and shipped to museums and private collections back east. Philetus Norris himself was an avid collector, sending crates of indigenous artifacts to institutions in Washington and New York. These weren't archaeological excavations conducted with care and documentation. They were acts of appropriation, taking objects that had spiritual and cultural significance to the people who had been forced out, and displaying them as curiosities, as evidence of a vanished people, as if the vanishing had been natural and inevitable rather than forced and deliberate. By the mid-1880s, the transformation was complete. Yellowstone had become exactly what its creators envisioned, a pristine wilderness where tourists could experience nature without the complication of encountering the people who had lived there for 10,000 years. In 1886, the United States Army officially took over administration of the park, and Captain Moses Harris established permanent military presence at Fort Yellowstone. The fort's mission was never about protecting geysers or bison. It was about maintaining the fiction that this land had always been empty, about preventing the return of anyone who might challenge that narrative. For the next 3 decades, as Yellowstone's reputation grew and visitor numbers increased, an entire generation of Americans grew up believing they were visiting untouched wilderness, never knowing that what they were really seeing was the site of one of the most complete acts of cultural erasure in American history. A place where thousands of years of human presence had been deliberately erased so thoroughly that most people who visit today have no idea it ever existed. Dakota is back at the lower falls now, on her last day in Yellowstone, and something has shifted. She spent yesterday at the park's Heritage and Research Center, a facility most tourists never visit, tucked away from the main attractions. She asked questions. She requested access to archival materials, What she found changed everything. The archaeological record is undeniable. Over 10,000 years of documented human occupation in the Yellowstone region, evidenced by thousands of artifacts, hundreds of documented sites, tool-making locations, ceremonial grounds, and seasonal camps. In 2016, researchers from the University of Montana discovered a series of stone circles near Old Faithful, structures that analysis confirmed were Shoshone ceremonial sites dating back over 300 years. The discovery was documented, catalogued, and then quietly shelved. No public announcement, no interpretive signs, no acknowledgement that what tourists were walking past wasn't just geological curiosity, but sacred ground. The evidence exists everywhere if you know where to look, and if you're allowed to look. Obsidian Cliff, that mountain of volcanic glass the Shoshone quarried for 11 millennia, is now a protected geological feature. You can see it from the road. You can read the Park Service sign that explains its geological formation. What the sign doesn't mention is that this was one of the most important indigenous resource sites in North America, a place where families returned generation after generation to craft tools that would be traded across the continent. The Shoshone still consider it sacred. They are prohibited from collecting obsidian there now. Park regulations classify it as theft of federal property. The irony would be almost funny if it weren't so devastating. The Fort Bridger Treaty of 1868 was never formally revoked. Legally, technically, the provisions guaranteeing Eastern Shoshone access to portions of Yellowstone remain in effect, simply ignored. In the early 2000s, Eastern Shoshone tribal leaders formally requested annual ceremonial access to specific sites within the park, locations that hold spiritual significance, places where their ancestors conducted rituals for thousands of years. The request was denied. Park regulations regarding public use and resource protection were cited as reasons. The same regulations that allow 4 million tourists per year to walk freely through these areas somehow cannot accommodate a small group of indigenous peoples seeking to maintain their cultural practices on their own ancestral land. Dr. Raina Blackburn, a Crow historian who has spent decades researching indigenous displacement in the Rocky Mountain region, describes the situation with careful academic language that barely contains her frustration. She has documented over 40 distinct Shoshone, Crow, and Bannock sites within current park boundaries, each one supported by archaeological evidence, historical accounts, and oral histories passed down through generations. None of them, not a single one, is acknowledged by official park signage. Yellowstone has over 2,000 historical markers explaining geological features, wildlife habitats, and the history of park development. The number that mention the 5 indigenous nations forcibly removed to create the park is 0. Not one plaque, not one monument, not one acknowledgement that this land was home to human communities for 10,000 years before it became America's playground. There is a descendant of Washakie living today, a man who bears his great-great-grandfather's name with quiet pride. He has visited Yellowstone 3 times, each time as a tourist, paying the entrance fee like everyone else, following the designated trails, reading the sanitized history on interpretive signs that describe the park's creation as if it were simply a matter of Congress deciding to preserve natural beauty. He describes the experience as surreal, walking through land his ancestors knew intimately, land they named and understood and lived on, and being treated as just another visitor with no special connection, no particular history, no claim beyond the price of admission. When he has tried to explain to park rangers who he is, what his family's connection to this place means, he has been met with polite interest and nothing more, as if his heritage were a curious historical footnote rather than a living connection to a profound injustice. 4 million people visit Yellowstone every year. They leave with memories of geysers and wildlife, with photos of stunning landscapes, with a sense that they have experienced something pure and timeless. They believe they have seen wilderness preserved, nature protected, America at its best. What they have actually seen is the result of systematic removal, cultural erasure, and historical revision so complete that it has become invisible. The question that remains, the one that sits heavy and uncomfortable, is what it means that we call this our best idea. That we celebrate the creation of Yellowstone as a triumph of conservation when it required the destruction of communities, the violation of treaties, and the deliberate erasure of 10,000 years of human history. Understanding these events helps us learn from the past. The historical record reveals a more complex story than the one told in guidebooks and visitor centers. Next time you see a photo of Old Faithful or the Grand Prismatic Spring, remember what had to happen for those images to exist. Remember whose land you're looking at, and ask yourself why, after 150 years, we still haven't found a way to tell the whole truth about America's first national park.